Hi everyone, I'm Alex Rosenfeld, founder of Freshwater Investments, and this is Coffee with the T-Bird podcast. I sit down with fellow T-Birds who are making an impact in business, leadership, and entrepreneurship. Each episode features conversations that explore the pivotal moments, personal motivations, and lessons learned on their journeys. Whether you're a student, alum, or someone passionate about business and personal growth, you'll walk away with fresh ideas. This is a bit more than a podcast. It's a platform for connections, storytelling, and celebrating the global spirit of Thunderbird. This podcast is sponsored by Freshwater Investments. At Freshwater, we make it simple for you to invest in large apartment communities across the United States so you can earn passive income, grow your capital, and benefit from real estate tax breaks without owning or managing property yourself. Hello, everyone. My guest today is Marco Molinari, a global business executive who's led billion-dollar divisions at Goodyear and HNI, scaled teams across 4 continents, and turned complexity into growth. He speaks 4 languages, holds degrees in engineering and international business, and has spent decades mastering lean operations, global expansion, and high-stakes leadership. Marco, welcome to the show.
Great to be here, Alex. I really enjoyed to meet a fellow T-Bird again.
Excellent. Thank you. Where's your home right now today?
Right now, I'm sitting on the shores here of Lake Pepin in Lake City, Minnesota, just about an hour south of the Twin Cities in Minnesota.
Excellent. So we'll start the show with a campaign that you led at Goodyear, and it was called a celebrity endorsed campaign that was very successful for Goodyear. So can we start there and explore who was the celebrity, how they helped you grow the business at that point? How did this whole campaign come about?
Yeah, it sort of takes me back 30-some years, okay? And I guess it ages me quickly here. But we ran a campaign in the mid-90s when I first came back from Europe to North America to run sales and marketing in North America. And the celebrity endorsed campaign was with, Wayne Gretzky. Wayne Gretzky is one of these guys that sort of, is beyond the sport itself, right? Like a Michael Jordan of his sport, right?
Yeah, it's like getting Roger Federer to run your campaign right now.
Exactly. And really, the background goes back to the 70s, late 70s. Goodyear launched the first ever all-season tire, the Tempo tire. And then over decades, everybody thought, hey, you don't need anything but an all-season tire, right? It works in every season. But as we know, tires, as many other products, are compromises. And the all-season tire was a compromise for many of the northern markets. Whether you're in Minnesota or you're in Canada or North Dakota, winter tires still is a needed product. So to relaunch winter tires in North America for Goodyear, we said, hey, it's not just about the product, but it's also about how do we break through the clutter of the market, right? How do we create excitement around the product? So we got Wayne Gretzky to work with us, and he was part of a number of events for us, both in the U.S. and in Canada, as Canada was a very important market for us as well.
How did you decide that it's going to be Wayne Gretzky versus somebody else? And how did you reach out to him or his agent?
I think it's one of these things. At that point in time, we were working together with J. Walter Thompson out of Detroit, our ad agency. And, we sat down and said, okay, if we want somebody to support this campaign and, again, break through the clutter out there, who best sort of embodies winter and who best embodies performance on ice, if you will. And obviously, hockey came to mind. And when hockey came to mind, Wayne Gretzky came to mind. As he's called, the Great One, helped launch our great tires, if you will, back then, the Ultra Grip range of winter tires.
And was he still playing at that time? Was he active?
He was still playing. At that time, he was with the New York Rangers, which was towards the end of his career, having, started in Edmonton, gone through Los Angeles, and then ended up with the New York Rangers. So we ran, some events with him in New York City as well, at the Garden, which obviously was, again, it's a pinnacle of sports as well. New York City and the Garden and Wayne Gretzky all in one.
That's great. And what was he easy to work with? And he agreed to work with you kind of easily, or it took some negotiations?
He's a phenomenal guy. Sometimes you see these celebrities and you see these great athletes and you think that they're sort of untouchables, but he's a very personable guy. At that time he was married with a young family, and after this we offered that, hey, if you want to go back to Los Angeles where the family is and take a ride in the blimp with the family, we would love to host you on the blimp. And I still remember how we said, well, I'm not so sure about that because I did see what happened to the Hindenburg. And we said, well, we just kind of filled the blimps with slightly different chemicals than they did back then. Okay, so he did take a trip with his family in the Goodyear blimp out in California, and he participated in some of our larger dealer events as well. A very humble guy. Clearly, that kind of a background, hard work is what took him to the pinnacle of his sport, and we were just very happy to have worked with him, and obviously created a lot of excitement in those northern states and Canada, where he was kind of viewed as the pinnacle of his sport.
Right. Yep. No, that's a great story. Thank you for sharing. So let me take you back to your childhood, growing up in Sweden. Can you talk a little bit about your family, your parents, and what it was like to grow up in Sweden?
Sure. I think my background is really what eventually got me to Thunderbird, right? And it kind of almost goes back to the end of World War II when the Marines liberated Venice, where my father was born and grew up. And back from that day on, he never forgot what the Americans did, for Europe and what the Americans did for the Italians. So when he went to Sweden, in the early 50s, as a lot of Southerners went to northern countries looking for work, he always brought that love for the U.S. with him. And I was raised, by a Swedish mother and Italian father, sort of in a bilingual household, traveled a lot through my sport, so that also got me very interested sort of in the international side of the world, and it really kind of laid a foundation for my interest in coming to the U.S.
And what was your sport when you were growing up?
Growing up, I was a tennis player. I say growing up because I think I've grown up now, and I don't think I'm the tennis player I once was. But, tennis gave me the opportunity to travel. Tennis gave me the opportunity to receive a scholarship and play tennis at the college level in the U.S. Tennis is what gave me the opportunity to then meet my wife at St. Louis University. And that sort of, again, laid a foundation for, sort of my next phase, which was then Thunderbird.
That's great. So did you switch to pickleball yet, or you still playing tennis?
I do play pickleball, and I think tennis gives me a tremendous advantage, when I do play pickleball, okay? And it is fun. And I like sports like that because I think they really give a larger percentage of the population the opportunity to get out there and exercise in whatever form, because tennis is a tough sport to start later in life. It's technically tough, it's physically tough, whereas pickleball, almost like table tennis, you can actually perform it without moving too much.
Yeah, that's true. So can you talk about any person that influenced you early in your life, in your childhood, you were kind of looking up to?
Well, you always look up to your parents, right, in one way or another, right? And obviously my father's story, and coming to Sweden and then making a life for himself there, was one who opened my eyes to sort of the rest of the world, right? My mother, Swedish mother, she had been raised in her youth to travel a lot. Her family sent her around the world, whether it was to France to study, England to study, so those were always things that I looked up to, always aspirations I had to one day myself travel abroad, study abroad, see and learn about other cultures, other ways of doing things and so on. So I think in the early years, I would say they were certainly very influential in my life. Later, of course, I had other mentors along the way, who really kept helping me develop myself and helping me stretch myself and take me towards the next phase of my life.
Excellent. And what did they do professionally, your parents?
My father was really a linguist and became an interpreter and translator, both sort of on the document level, but also very much in the world of the judicial system. He was, at his time, the only authorized court translator for Italian in Sweden. So obviously, he was employed often and frequently when unfortunate Italians got into legal trouble. My mother also was degreed and grew up and ended up more in the world of sort of executive secretarial kind of work, working for a number of CEOs in various industries in Sweden.
And so you always knew that you want to go and study in the States when you were in high school?
Well, yeah, during my high school years in Sweden in the mid to late 70s, it became sort of more popular to do these exchange programs. You had things like Rotary, you had things like AFS, you had things like Youth for Understanding, and my father encouraged me, both my parents, for that matter, encouraged me to do that. So we applied, and I became an exchange student for a year in upstate New York, outside of Syracuse, New York. And obviously that was before all the technologies that we have today, right, that we're using right now, right? So really you were forced to immerse yourself into that culture, into the American culture, into the school system, into the sports. And it was it was eye-opening for me. During that year, I kept competing in tennis, and I didn't never have any intentions of staying in the States really until I ended up competing in the New York State championships, and a few college coaches sort of got a glimpse of me, and I ended up with several scholarship opportunities to play tennis in college, and one of them was St. Louis University, and after a fly back there, I decided, hey, I might as well stay here and study and play tennis versus going back to Sweden where, university would also have been free for me. But, doing it in the U.S. with the opportunity of traveling while I was playing, was really appealing to me.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. And you were studying mechanical engineering, right?
No, actually, my engineering was kind of a pre-engineering degree that I did in Sweden, still part of my last year in high school in Sweden. And then when I came to St. Louis University, I really immersed myself more in general business, and then with a marketing concentration. And it was really, one of my professors my senior year, Stephen Miller at St. Louis University, I took a class in sort of international marketing to sort of see what it was, more of an introductory course. And he was really the one that encouraged me to pursue, an MBA or a master's in international studies. And at that time, really, there were only two programs out there that offered that. The one was Thunderbird, and the other one was University of South Carolina had a program called a MIPS program. Applied to both of them, got accepted to both of them, but somehow the Thunderbird brand, the Thunderbird mystique really convinced me to go down that path.
Excellent. Excellent. And how was your Thunderbird experience? What was your favorite memories from being a Thunderbird?
Well, many, I would say. First of all, that campus itself back then, was kind of the way it was when it was an Air Force base. So it really was pretty cool. In that sense, Glendale at that time was out in the desert. There was nothing around it. I wish I would have had a couple of $100 to buy a plot of land back then, and I probably wouldn't have had to work anymore, considering the ways, Phoenix, grew out that way as well. So my favorite memories were some of these courses that really were very much, applying business theory and not just continuing with business theory, right? So I think we, one of my courses was a 400 level course where we were going to help Republic Airlines find new routes for them. And of course, Republic Airlines is like generations ago been absorbed by other airlines. Okay, so we had a chance, of course, to travel to these airports, to travel and meet with the Republic Airlines executives, and really kind of do hands-on type work, right? We did a similar one for Irish Spring. I can't remember the country that we looked at, introducing Irish Spring. I think it was maybe Germany, because I think we called it Irische Frühling, to launch it there. So, from a course perspective, a class perspective, I still remember, international finance and trade with Wayne Foster as the professor, right? It really opened up, my eyes to, the whole way that trade worked back in those days, right? Or one of the economics class with Dick Mahoney, okay, who I still believe still is working within the U.S. government as one of the premier experts in economic policy, okay? So, I never was a good student in high school. I was an average student early in college, but it seemed like the more I sort of started to enjoy what I was doing in school, the better my grades became, right? So, I really was very engaged and very enthused during my latter time at Thunderbird. And then, of course, you can't forget pub nights. You can't forget, sort of the rugby games. You can't forget some of the soccer games. Really, Thunderbird at that time was a island out in Glendale, right? And everything happened on campus, right? So I was a little bit sad to see, obviously, being absorbed into ASU and subsequently sort of becoming, an appendix to ASU, if you will, okay? But I think they seem like they're still doing a good job keeping it somewhat distinct and somewhat separate from sort of the regular ASU type programs.
Yeah. And the new building is great too.
Yeah, I haven't been there yet, so.
You should visit. It's a great building, and
I'll do that.
They brought a lot of memorabilia from the old campus into the building and in the hallway, so it's very nice. So how did you find your first job after Thunderbird?
That was the other thing that I loved about Thunderbird, right? Is the career placement, right? You had to sign up and see if there were companies coming on campus, so you had to sign up and say, hey, I'm interested in meeting with this company, with that company, and so on. And I remember signing up, Procter & Gamble was always a favorite, right? So signed up to meet with them when they came on campus. Goodyear, I think I had GTE at that time as well. And, and you were lucky to sort of get selected, right? And then you went through an initial screening on campus. And I still remember the one with Procter & Gamble, which was fascinating because the group of us had dinner together with Edwin Arzt. Edwin Arzt at that time was the president of the international division of Procter & Gamble, and subsequently he became, the chairman and CEO of Procter & Gamble for a number of years, right? So Thunderbird really also was the pinnacle for many of these companies, sort of Fortune 50, Fortune 500 type companies, who saw Thunderbird as a great, great source of students who were very much open to, a non-traditional business life, if you will, because at that time, obviously, working around the world wasn't as simple as it has become in these days, right? So I ended up with 2 flybacks, as they call them back then. Maybe they still call them that. One was with Procter & Gamble, and one was with Goodyear. And Procter & Gamble, I flew to Cincinnati, and they offered me the opportunity to go back to Sweden and work for Procter & Gamble. I said, hey, I'm from Sweden. That's not really what I'm looking at, is going back to Sweden. And Goodyear had a phenomenal, international management trainee program. And I was always a big Formula One fan. I was always, fan about automobiles and so on. I had to fly back there together with another, gentleman, Art. Art and I have stayed in touch over the years, and I got the opportunity to join that program at Goodyear back in March of 1984.
Did you go to Germany at that time?
Yeah, so, again, what I loved back in the day, I don't know if it's always the case these days, is I spent almost a better part of 6-7 months in Akron, Ohio, going through all kinds of training. It was product selling skills. It was, product training on consumer tires and truck tires and earth mover tires. It was spending a month in a factory in Fayetteville, North Carolina, building tires. It was, doing truck tire surveys in Kentucky. Okay. So, by the time you were done with all of that, you had a pretty good understanding of the product, of the selling process, of the development and building of the product. And then typically what Goodyear did back then is they wanted to send you to a country where they had retail. So they would put you into sort of the retail organization to kind of run a retail store, again, to sort of develop you bottom up. My friend, Jim Plowan, and myself, who were going through that program together, he got sent down to Argentina, and I got sent to Germany, to Cologne, West Germany. And when I started there, they didn't think that I had developed strong enough German-speaking skills, so they put me in an additional couple of weeks of one-to-one, 8-hour-a-day language training, after which then they put me into a retail store up in Recklinghausen, which is about an hour or so north of Cologne in North Rhine-Westphalia. And I ran that retail store for about a year and a half. And after that, they sort of pulled me back and say, okay, I want you to do the marketing for this retail chain now. So it really was kind of, building a foundation that then, I have to say I've drawn from that, still to this day. Some of those learnings, they just become sort of part of your DNA, and it was very, very exciting that those early years in Germany, which then sort of were foundational for the next stages of my career there.
And then you went to Eastern Europe, or you've done some acquisition in Eastern Europe, right?
We often we were pretty advanced in a lot of our marketing that we did in Germany at the retail level, and we often had visitors, Brazil, Sweden, and so on. And actually, the managing director from Sweden, Goodyear Sweden, came down and saw what we were doing, and I was ready to move on at that time. And he asked, "Hey, could we have Marco come up to Sweden here and help us with sort of channel management and distribution planning in Scandinavia?" So that's kind of was my next stage. I went back to Stockholm, where I was from, and I had the opportunity to develop their channel management and distribution strategies primarily for Norway and for Sweden. And again, some of the things we did back then are still today sort of part of the foundation for some of the organizations there. And that was very exciting. After that, I got the opportunity to go down to Zurich, Switzerland, spent a couple of months preparing to take over, as a general manager for Switzerland and Austria, which was about $100 million business between those two countries. And it was during that time that, the wall came down. It had just come down, I believe, in 89. It came down November of 89. Goodyear, like many companies, wanted to enter into Central and Eastern Europe. So, with Vienna geographically located where it is, we said, let's use sort of, Molinari and Vienna sort of as a platform to initially, move into some of these, not really Eastern countries, more Central European countries, as you would name them today. Czechoslovakia at that time, Slovenia, Poland, and started out very much through a export model, right? We set up selling offices in these countries, exporting products from the West in there, which obviously, over time were to high cost to be able to compete in those markets. So we started during my next assignment when I was a vice president of sales and marketing for Europe. We started to look at these markets. Where can we make some acquisitions? So together with the president of Europe, Bill Sharp, at that time, we started to look around Central and Eastern Europe, and we found, obviously Poland as a large country, very well educated people, especially when it came to the area of engineering and manufacturing process and so on. So we looked at their tire industry, and we ended up doing a due diligence on it. We ended up bidding for the entire tire industry in Poland. They were smart enough, the Polish government was smart enough that they said, well, we're going to accept you, but we're going to divide this thing up a little bit, and they probably got a little bit more money that way. So we bought a brand and a company called Dębica, down in Dębica, and Michelin bought a company in Olsztyn, and Bridgestone ended up buying a company down in Poznan. So they kind of divided up the industry with the three large global players, if you will. And that was fascinating.
And those were manufacturing companies?
They were actually all part of the same state-owned company, but they were separate manufacturing facility. So Dębica that we ended up buying was more of a consumer tire, passenger tire, light truck focused factory. Olsztyn that Michelin bought was more truck and earth mover, And then Poznan that Bridgestone acquired was more sort of military type, tires or tires for military type applications. So, after that, obviously, all three of us invested heavily in those factories. It was fascinating. We had to present to the Polish government on a number of occasions. I remember presenting to three different Polish governments as they kept on, changing government, going from one government to the next, right? I think the last government we presented to was the Walesa-led government. And, you learn a lot of things during those times, right? I mean, for them, it wasn't so much about the capital that we would invest there. It was really about jobs, right? Hey, you can't come in here. I think at that time they had something like 5,000 people in that factory. It says, I understand you guys can come in here, you can put a lot of capital in here, and you can drive productivity very quickly, but what happens to these people, right? So you had to kind of work that. It was part of the plan, a 5-6 year plan that was all about sort of maintaining jobs, redeploying jobs. So as you invested capital, you also were trying to drive growth, so that growth would absorb the excess people that you had. And it was a fascinating process to go through. After that, we did something similar in Slovenia with a company called Sava. Okay, so it really helped sort of solidify Goodyear's position in Central and Eastern Europe. And probably, even to this day, that acquisition in Poland may have been the most accretive, highest return acquisition, Goodyear ever made, right? Because didn't pay a lot for it, but generated, a lot, both in terms of growth in those markets, but also in terms of, production that was then leveraged over in the Western countries of Europe.
Yeah, and I want to ask you about a question about the marketing side of the business. How did you compete with a giant like Michelin in Europe? How did you differentiate yourself?
Well, it's a good question, right? I mean, growing up in that market, with Goodyear, you always try to be the disruptor, right? Michelin still to this day, if you look at it, was really the technological leader, right? So they were leading very much with technology and maybe, quality and product performance, right? So for us, it was very much to find other ways of differentiating ourselves, right? Not just saying, hey, we just got the same tire at a lower cost, right? That would be too easy, right? So, we kind of focused very much on segments that they weren't necessarily focused on, right? They were very much of a commodity segment product at that time. And I'm talking about sort of passenger tires, right? So we try to go in there, and we were then the first one to launch all-season tires in Europe, right? And of course, they fought that, and said, hey, there is no such thing as an all-season tire. It's a compromise. You got to have summer, you got to have winter, right? So that was a way for us through marketing and proving that in many countries of Europe, you really don't need both tires, right? The other way was we were very heavily engaged at that time, still in Formula One. And Michelin, had exited Formula One, and we were kind of the only player in Formula One. So we placed a lot of our sort of marketing dollars and our focus on the high performance segment of the market, and which obviously is also the more profitable segment of the market. So we had great success in Germany with that, which of course was the premier market with no speed limits, strong brands, etc., automotive brands. Okay, so, part of it from a marketing standpoint was, okay, what segments should we focus on? And then what do we do inside of those segments, okay, to get people excited about us, right? So, being the only one that had all-season tires, that helped us also on the dealer front, right? Because it gave the dealers the opportunity to say, hey, we got a product here that only Goodyear dealers carry, right? And the Formula One thing allowed us to engage a lot of these dealer principals and their employees. We invited them. Every race, we would have 20, 30, 40 dealer principals and employees attend those races, whether it was Silverstone or it was Hockenheim or it was San Marino, wherever that was, we would bring them there. And again, as global as business is, at the end of the day, it's all about the local relationships that you're able to generate, right? Because there's not a huge differentiation between those products, right? But it's really, those dealer relations that you can develop and nurture that then when they go back to work, they remember those as well. So a lot of it was around those types of aspects. And obviously we then leveraged that into our, advertising and our advertising campaigns and our local, co-op advertising that we were generating as well. Okay. So that's kind of how we try to, compete with somebody like, but, it wasn't just Michelin. If you think about it, right? Michelin was clear number one, was a clear number one in Europe and obviously clear number one in France. Continental was a major player and a clear number one in Germany. Pirelli, clear number one in Italy. You had Semperit, the clear number one in Austria. You had Gislaved, clear number one in Sweden. Back then, you still had a lot of domestic brands. So when you came in there as a non-European brand, in each one of these countries, in some ways, you had to tailor your tune and tailor your marketing and go-to-market strategies because you were competing with different brands who also positioned themselves somewhat differently in the market.
Right. Just curious, what percentage of your revenue was marketing budget?
Oh boy,
just a ballpark.
I would say that if we take sort of above the line, below the line, we typically were spending around 2 to 2.5%.
Excellent.
So it was a fair chunk, if you will. It was definitely an important line item for us, and one of the things we tried to do, especially when I was in North America, was really find ways of in a scientific manner, seeing how we were generating a return on that, which isn't always easy, as you know, with marketing or advertising dollars.
Yeah. So you spent about 18 years at Goodyear?
I did, yes.
Can you talk about a few very important lessons for you personally or for business lesson that you learned throughout the 18-year career with Goodyear?
Oh, there were obviously several, right? And I would say one that always stands out to me is don't always assume that a good number is a good number, right? When I first came to the UK and I took over as managing director of the UK, I remember we just had several terrific months and a terrific quarter. I kind of said, hey, I guess we're doing, and we weren't really, I wasn't smart enough, I wasn't experienced enough to understand I really need to peel back on this onion and understand, are the results as good as I think they are, right? And I didn't do that, right? And that was a hard lesson, when we finally did actually, do ourselves and say, hey, we got to go and better understand this. But it was kind of a bit too late in the sense that we had way too many dollars then sitting in WIP, okay, work in process, that somehow have gotten booked as a profit, okay. So we had to obviously reset all of that. So that was a real learning lesson, I have to say, from a financial perspective, that hey, don't assume that things look great, that they are great. You got to understand overperformance as well as underperformance, right? And you got to go back to root cause, and you got to do your proper analysis, to understand, not only the root cause, but then what are the drivers of that root cause, and then how do you go about fixing it and assuring that it doesn't happen again. I think that was one big learning lesson. I think a fascinating learning lesson for me was, as the first sort of non-American to have come in and run, as vice president of sales and marketing in North America. I had always been in Europe fighting to become number one, right? With Michelin number one. Coming into North America, all of a sudden I was leading an organization that was number one in the market. A fascinating learning pretty early on for me was how complacent the organization was because it was number one in the market, right? Sometimes, not sometimes, I find that you fight a lot harder to become number one. And sometimes people, once they reach that position, they take the foot off the accelerator and they start coasting. And I think we were coasting in many areas. So that, again, was sort of allowing me to go back and say, okay, why are we coasting? Where are we coasting? Some of it was people-driven, right? And some of it was process-driven. So, we were lacking, in my regard, innovation, right? kind of the example that I gave you with winter tires early on when we started our discussion, right? They were just going on and on saying, hey, all-season tires, it's great. Let's bring out another all-season tire. Well, okay, that's your core business, but how do you transform that core? How do you find within that core a way to niche and develop another segment that you now can grow faster, that's more profitable, that's maybe more unique in the market? So I think that's another great learning for me, is really that, never get complacent, right? The moment you start to feel good, the moment you start to feel like, hey, numbers are great and so on, that's a little bit the Icarus syndrome, right? You're getting a little bit too close to the sun, okay? And it's time to rethink things.
Yeah, I appreciate sharing that. So let's switch to your HNI career. Can you tell us about the company first, and how did you build the international division there?
Well, the company HNI Corporation is a company that was founded in Muscatine, Iowa, a small town by the Mississippi, and it was started by three gentlemen who, at the end of World War II, had all of these returning servicemen, and they didn't know how to find work for them. So they started this company called Homonize at that point in time. How do you do something in your home, homonize it? And they didn't really have a product when they first started. And they started out then with making kitchen cabinets. Eventually, when they started to run out of steel, they had to switch to little small recipe boxes out of metal. And one of the early founders said, well, if we can make small ones, business is growing now in the world. A lot of paper is being created. They invented the vertical file, okay? And, so they went from Homonize, and they just shortened it. They took three of those letters and it became HON, H-O-N. And that's kind of how the company started, in the office furniture business. And then they started to do desks and files and chairs, and they grew that business under the HON brand. And eventually that then evolved through acquisitions and growth into what became HON Industries, a number of brands: HON, Allsteel, Gunlock, HBF, companies that were acquired, and they grew this office furniture company to become a real sort of contender in the U.S. market. At some point, they acquired a small fireplace company called Heatilator that they've grown to what today is the largest, most profitable fireplace company in the world. It's called Hearth and Home Technologies. When I was at Goodyear, and I was recruited here by Stan Askren, who was the CEO at HON Industries at that time. HON was a company that was highly profitable, had embraced lean already in the early 90s. I was a lean practitioner, strong cash flows, and very strong corporate values. It's interesting to highlight here, a little pitch for them, is that they actually paid profit sharing to its members before they even paid dividends to shareholders. And that still today holds true. HNI today continues to pay profit sharing. Obviously, you got to hit a certain threshold. And once you get above that threshold, typically the thinking was always a third back in the company, a third to shareholders, and a third to our own members. And by the way, they're not called employees; they're called members because they share in the ownership of the company, if you will. So I saw the opportunity, it was a small company, a lot smaller than Goodyear. It was really a company with strong cultural values, with a CEO that was ready to sort of invest and expand internationally, and with very strong cash flows. So I kind of looked at it a little bit as a friendly VC opportunity, if you will, an internal VC opportunity. And I joined there after Goodyear. And, we started out by traveling the world and really trying to understand the world of office furniture, if you will, or the world of workplace work, if you will. And pretty quickly drew some conclusions and some hypotheses, right? Different from the tire business. This is a low capital intensive industry, right? If you will, the sauce in this industry is really all about the go-to-market strategy. It's really all about dealer distribution. It's all about, understanding how work is being conducted and so on, right? It's not as much about manufacturing itself. It's a pretty low-cost industry to get into. It's very fragmented around the world. Very seldom do you have a country where the top 5 players in the market has more than 20-25% market share. So it's a very tough industry to sort of go in and say, hey, we're going to start out organically. We're going to, put a beachhead in and we're going to sort of grow it, right? Relationships in that industry are also very long. A lot of the business traditionally was always government business as well, right? A little bit less so these days, okay? So, we had the opportunity then to sort of look and say, okay, well, what about Western Europe? No, Western Europe, slow growth to no growth, lots of competitors, very fragmented. So we said it's not the right place to go, right? We had some people in Central and Eastern Europe that was of interest to us. And then very quickly we ended up out in Asia. We studied India, we studied China. And then we ended up buying a market leader in Hong Kong that was really a Chinese company, but a Hong Kong base. And it was a terrific investment for us. Following that, we made an investment in an acquisition in India. Now, subsequently, fast forward, some 20 years, as the world has changed, HNI Industries decided to divest of China, decided to divest of India, and just yesterday made a huge announcement when they acquired Steelcase, who's been globally the leader for many, many, many decades. So this little company from Muscatine, Iowa, who started out making, recipe boxes, today, is a $5.8 billion global company that is by far the largest in its industry, okay? So the great thing about that journey for me was really that I could apply everything I had learned throughout my 18 years at Goodyear, and especially kind of going to the markets, right? That's kind of how I grew up at Goodyear. You start grassroots level, right? So I traveled the world and got to know most companies around the world in this industry and the markets and understood what the drivers were. And I think that helped us very much decide, hey, where do we go? How do we go in there? Is it build versus buy? And then who do we buy? And then how do we do the proper due diligence? And then, how do we then, manage these companies afterwards so they, create shareholder value, economic value, to the core business in the U.S., if you will.
And running business in Asia, in China, in India, how is it different from running business and scaling business in Europe?
It's obviously very different in many ways. But one of the things that, our CEO, Stan Askren, at the time said, hey, we need to make sure that we apply the same diligence around, culture, around values, around compliance, around, quality of living quarters for, we had workers that lived on our campus in China. So, that's really where we started. And that was really foundational for us. It was really to say, we need to make sure that even our kids could live in these dorms as it was a college dorm. So I think with that, we set a signal very early on to the workers over there that we weren't there for cheap labor. We weren't there to take advantage of that part of the world. We were really in China for China. We used to always say that we're in China for China. We're not there to source and send back. We're there to grow that business, right? So they saw from an early stage that we were respectful of their culture. We were respectful of them as human beings. And then we brought tools and practices to them, specifically in the area of lean. A lot of people always think, hey, lean is all about cost. Lean is all about reducing cost. But really, lean for us was all about, first and foremost, was about safety. Second was really about reducing complexity. It was about driving speed. It wasn't about reducing the workforce. Now, we were somewhat lucky in that part of the world. First of all, the Chinese workers, they know they're one of 1.5 billion, so they know they got to learn to compete against whoever is next to them. So they embraced everything we brought them, right? And they were, they move fast, they learn fast, they implement fast. The second thing is, but they also always are looking for, can I go somewhere else where I can make a little bit more money? So as we were driving lean, we were also losing people, and we weren't necessarily replacing them because we were adding productivity. So they were kind of helping us, to add that productivity, by some of, obviously we didn't want to lose all the skilled workers. Okay. So we have specific ways of holding on to them. So I think the difference is, how do you, first of all, you got to make sure you treat them with fairness and respect from day one. It doesn't matter where you do business in the world, right? These are human beings. I still vividly remember one of the people who ran that company when we bought it saying, well, lives aren't worth as much here as they are in the U.S. And that was like shocking to hear, right? Because we said, hey, what child sits at home and says goodbye to their dad going to work and then doesn't care if the father comes back from work, right? It doesn't exist. I think a life is a life, doesn't matter where it is around the world, right? So I think, that is something, if you do that early on, I think you're going to get people to want to work with you, okay? The second thing is, to teach them, don't buy fish for them, teach them how to fish, right? We brought a lot of learnings to them, and many of them, it helped to get their next job, but many of them, it helped just be successful within our company, right? And then finally, what we said, let's be sure we don't do something there just because we can. Let's be sure we leverage the parent company where it makes the most sense. Some companies I've seen over the years, they throw everything at their acquisition over in Asia, and they think, okay, let's use it all because it works in the U.S. No, you got to really understand what's leverageable, what's not leverageable, what's need to be local, what can be global, and so on, right? It's not about best total cost, it's a best total local cost, right? So, I would say it's a lot of time and effort that you got to spend on the ground. It's not something you can do running from the corporate head office. I typically was there every month for a week to 10 days, right? So that is a significant personal investment, but that's how you make it work. Obviously, you have to find leaders who also embrace that thinking. We brought in a leader in China early on, a fellow by the name of Peter Chu, who came out of Emerson and Carrier. So we were looking for sort of Chinese nationals that understood and had maybe worked for other sort of publicly traded U.S. companies. They understood sort of how value is created within a U.S. public company, right? But by the same token, they understand the local culture. They speak the local language, right? So they can basically both be a bridge, but also be a very effective local leader, right? We went on a similar journey in India. And India was a lot harder than China. The company we bought in India, was not, I would say it was not a faded market leader like our acquisition in China was. It was really a turnaround in India. And it took a lot longer to make that turnaround. But eventually, it became, and it is today, the premier company in its industry. And it's led by, terrific young, Indian Karan Sachdev, who did his studies at Washington University in St. Louis, his MBA, worked for us in the U.S. for many years, and then wanted back to India. And I was able to bring him back to India to eventually then lead that company, right? So it's like understanding local culture and language, but at the same time appreciating sort of the corporate values, the corporate value generation that's needed to be a successful subsidiary within a, publicly traded company.
Yeah. And so having this extensive knowledge of going global, what's the biggest mistakes companies make when they go global, and how to avoid them?
I don't want to sit here and, sort of be arrogant and say, these are the biggest mistakes companies make, because obviously I've made many mistakes. I made many mistakes, along the way. I think I was blessed with sort of growing up bottom up. And by the time I was in a position to kind of go in and make a significant sort of acquisition, like making one in China, I think I had sort of enough scars to know, the things to avoid, right? The number one is obviously the assumption that, what works back home is going to work over there as well, just because we are who we are, right? So that's number one, right? I think number two is not moving fast enough on the top of the company that you're acquiring, right? Obviously, you want to put somebody in your trust to run your finances for you in that company, right? Because at the end of the day, some of these countries, maybe rate a little bit higher on corruption indices than we do here in the U.S. and so on. So I think, be sure you get the right guy to run your finances for you, but more importantly, get the right guy at the top. The tone is set at the top. If you don't have somebody at the top that aligns with the core visions of the company, the core values of the company, it's hard to get those values to trickle down, right? So I would say, that's the second most important thing, right? The third one I would say is you have to go yourself, like we say in lean language. You have to go to Gemba. You have to go to the market. And to the market doesn't mean just go to the head office in that country, but you have to go spend time with influencers in that market. In our industry, it was architects and designers. It was real estate companies. It was large clients. It was even competitors, okay? You have to seek to understand before you can actually impact and influence and impact, right? So I think those are, don't move too fast and thinking that everything you're doing back home has relevance in that new market. Get the right leadership at the top and don't wait too long to do that. We waited a little bit too long to do that in India and we paid for it, okay? So that's certainly, a lesson that we had there. And then third, go to the market, as a lead, not sending other people there, but go there yourself, okay? And so that way, A, you can communicate with your CEO back home, B, you can communicate to the board, and that all drives credibility in what you're doing, right? And credibility is necessary when there are problems that pop up, and they will pop up, and people say, well, we trust that Molinari's got it right because he's on the bottom there, he rolls his sleeves up, he's in the market, he understands what's going on, okay? So I think those three things I would say are fundamental, to do. There are obviously a lot of things that come out of that as well that are important.
Excellent. Great. So what are you busy today with? What's your advising practice? And
well, I was, after retiring from HNI, in 2017, I ended up with an old colleague of mine from Goodyear. We got engaged by a large state-owned enterprise tire company in China to move, create that business here in the U.S. as well. And we kind of worked on that for a couple of years. We had, developed the brand. We done all the research for market entry. We had a letter of intent for setting up a factory on 800 acres in South Carolina. And it was going to be 2 stages of $500 million investments. And we were kind of ready to move to the next stage to get going. They decided during the first Trump administration that they were getting nervous. So they kind of pulled back on that. So that was kind of a couple of years spent on that. I was blessed to have the opportunity to work with HNI's current CEO, Jeff Loringer, on a couple of business development projects, kind of providing some additional horsepower on some of the work that they were doing. Right now, for the last couple of years, I've been helping consulting a German office furniture company called Deutsche out of Bavaria, outside of Nuremberg, and helping them transform their U.S. business, initially sort of as a non-exec chairman, and now kind of moving into the role more as a chairman of their advisory board as we brought in a strong new CEO for the U.S. business. So that keeps me busy. It keeps me thinking, and I enjoy it quite a bit, and I hope I can continue to do similar type of things still for a number of years.
Excellent. And before we wrap up, few quick questions. What advice would you give to a 20-year-old self, given what you know, given your experience today?
Well, number one is do what you did, okay? Because I'm so thankful for for the journey that I was able to embark on with the Thunderbird and then with Goodyear, okay? So I would not do a single thing differently, okay, number one. Number two is I would advise a 20-year-old not to assume that, hey, I'm not interested in international business because I want to work here in the U.S. Nothing is domestic or local these days. Everything is international. Everything is tied together one way or another. So I still believe that going to a place like Thunderbird, okay, is a terrific way of sort of opening the eyes for, how the world or how international business and economics sort of are intrinsically linked, okay? Number two is take on every opportunity that is offered you. Don't always look at things as it's got to be a promotion. Take on lateral moves, if that means that you're going to learn something new. Organizations are flatter than ever. You can sit and wait a long time for a promotion, and jumping from one company to another is not going to really get you there from a knowledge standpoint. So take on every opportunity that's thrown your way. Well, that's certainly what I always did that. For me, it was never to say, hey, I love Switzerland, okay, I don't want to go to Luxembourg, okay. I could have stayed in Switzerland my whole life, okay, as could my wife. But it was the right thing to do, okay. It was more learning, different learning that helped me along the way. I don't know what other, it's so hard because I think things have changed so much, Alex, right? I see that when I look at resumes, okay, I see how often people have changed companies and have moved. Sometimes it's very hard to discern how has this person created value spending 2 years in every location, right? Yeah, I don't understand that, right? Very often it does take 6 months to a year to really understand something before you can even start to impact it, let alone see the results.
Right.
So I guess that would be a third advice I would give people, okay? Don't think the grass is greener somewhere else. By the time you get there, that patch is brown as well. So you might as well find a way to create fertile ground where you're standing right now and sort of become the resident expert within your environment as well.
No, thank you. What's your investment philosophy? How are you preparing for retirement?
I would say, my wife and I, from an investment philosophy, have always been, fairly conservative in a way, right? I'm kind of a guy that says, I'm not going to make a killing on the way up, but I'm not going to get killed on the way down, right? So to me, it's long-term value creation. And some of that even come back from, my time at HNI, right? It's, look at it two ways. One is if you make an acquisition or you make an investment, you can't wait for it to pay off too long. Why? Because business cycles are just shorter and shorter, right? So you want to see at least that there is a payback maybe within 3 to 5 years, right? Having said that, though, then look for the long-term value creation. So, if I were to look at a mix, 50, 60% is probably, equities, and then you kind of look at some fixed income, and then obviously you always got to manage cash as well, okay, for a rainy day or whatever the next car you want to buy or the next boat you want to buy or the next travel vacation you want to buy or you want to go on, right? In today's day and age, it's having that philosophy, I think, helps quite a bit, right? If we go back to March, April of this year, everybody said it was doom and gloom, right? Now we're back here and we're, better than we were, back then, right? So, right. I think patience, and it's a long-term game, so play the long-term game. Then I believe also in the fundamentals of what are the industries that fundamentally will be there. And then, of course, you want to still look at some of the up-and-coming, right? Not being invested in AI today, you may miss a little bit of an opportunity, but being over-invested in AI today too could also become a little painful. If you pick the Yahoo of AI, it'll be painful for you. Okay, so you got to be sure you pick the Apple of AI or you pick your Microsoft of AI, right? So anyway, who knows? We're all wrong in the longer term, right?
Yeah. So what's your next travel destination?
Next travel destination, we just came back from Venice, bringing the family, kids and grandkids there for a week, enjoying time together on the beach. Next travel will probably be down to Texas to see our oldest son and his family. And then we do keep a boat on the East Coast that we like to travel on in the wintertime along the East Coast and Florida and so on. When it gets a little bit too cold here in Minnesota to to stay around.
Right. Excellent. And the last thing, do you have a message or a request for our audience, for Thunderbirds or for other people listening to us?
Yeah, I would say, all alumni that are out there, and I'm guilty of this as well, let's continue to uphold that brand. Let's continue to challenge Thunderbird leadership to keep that brand differentiated and unique, because I think today it can be as unique as it was in the mid-50s when it first started out. And I think we all owe a lot to Thunderbird. We paid our way through it, but we owe a lot to Thunderbird because it really launched us on that career path, if you will. And I think continuing to support and help Thunderbird to maintain brand differentiation, brand mystique, and the unique selling proposition of Thunderbird, I think is something that we ought to all work on together. And we do it in many ways. First Tuesdays, global get-togethers, and I'm also encouraging the Arizona State University leadership to continue to support Thunderbird the way they seem to be doing today.
Excellent. Thank you so much for this wonderful conversation. I really enjoyed it. Thank you for spending time with us, Marco, and all the best.
Well, I enjoyed it, Alex, and I think this is a terrific initiative that you've started here, because I think not only does it get individual stories out, but I think it supports what I just said around, the Thunderbird brand, okay, and what has the Thunderbird brand helped create out there around the world.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you.